There's a question that lives at the center of every serious musician's relationship with their work, and it is not the question they are usually asked. The questions they are usually asked are about influence and inspiration, and the creative process and the people who shape their sound. These are real questions, and they produce real answers, and the answers are interesting. But underneath all of them, quieter and more fundamental, is the question that rarely gets asked directly because it is too large and too uncomfortable, and its honest answer would reveal something about the nature of artistic motivation that most audiences prefer not to examine too closely. The question is this: if no one were listening, would you still play? Michael Bublé had never answered this question out loud. He had thought about it in the particular way that performers think about the questions that define their relationship to their own work, circling it, approaching it from different angles, never quite landing on an answer that felt complete. He had built his entire career around the audience, not cynically, not strategically, genuinely, out of the conviction that music was communication, and that communication required a recipient, and that the recipient was the point. He sang for the people in the rooms. He had said this in many forms across many interviews, and he meant it each time he said it. The audience was not a circumstance of his career, it was the reason for it. And then, on a night in 2012, when his tour bus broke down in a small Canadian town that was not on any itinerary anyone had intended to follow, and the crew settled into a roadside motel with the resigned efficiency of people who have learned to accommodate the unexpected logistics of touring life, Michael Bublé went for a walk, not to find anything, not because he was looking for anything. He went because it was late and the motel room was small and the night was clear and walking was something to do while the rest of the world slept. And 2 blocks from the motel, through the window of the only establishment on the main street that still had a light on, he heard something that made him stop walking and stand very still in the cold air of a Canadian night, listening with the full attention of someone who has just encountered something they did not know existed. He heard a piano. And he heard something in the playing of that piano, in the quality, the phrasing, the specific way the sound was being made, that told him immediately and without deliberation that whoever was playing was not doing it for anyone, was not performing, was not even in the usual sense practicing, was simply playing in the pure, uncomplicated, audience-independent way that music almost never gets to be, because the machinery of the music industry is so thoroughly designed around the presence of the audience that the music itself, the thing before the audience exists, the thing that does not need the audience to be real, is rarely what anyone gets to witness. The town was called Millhaven, not famous for anything in particular, the kind of settlement that exists across the Canadian interior in sufficient numbers that its specific characteristics are less important than its general ones. A main street with the businesses that main streets in small Canadian towns contain, a hardware store, a pharmacy, a diner that opened early for the farmers, a post office, a church at one end of the street, and a small community hall at the other, houses spreading back from the main street in the orderly, modest pattern of a place where space was not a premium and privacy was not a luxury, but simply the natural condition of living at a sufficient distance from your neighbors. The bar, it was called the Millhaven Arms, which was a grander name than the establishment itself quite warranted, occupied the middle of the main street in a building that had been several things over the course of its existence. A general store, a boarding house, briefly a dentist's office. It had been a bar for 30 years, under the management of the same family for most of that time, and it had the specific character of establishments that have been in the same hands long enough to reflect the personality of the people running them rather than the aggregate preferences of the market. There was a pool table that had not been level for 15 years. There were photographs on the wall of local hockey teams from decades past, and in the corner, on a small raised area that served the room's loose definition of a stage, there was an upright piano that had been there since before the bar was a bar, that had been tuned periodically and imperfectly over the decades, and that was currently being played by Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Marsh was 81 years old. She had been born in Millhaven, had lived her entire life within 20 kilometers of it, and had been playing piano since she was 6, 75 years of the same instrument, longer than most people's entire lives. Long enough for the relationship between her hands and the keys to have become something beyond skill and well into the territory of instinct, of the body knowing before the mind decides. Of music happening through her rather than being produced by her. She had not trained formally beyond the lessons of her childhood, taught by a woman in the next town who had studied at a conservatory in a city she had never returned to after the war. The formal training had stopped when Eleanor was 14. The playing had never stopped. Through school and marriage and the raising of 3 children and the death of her husband Gerald, and the gradual transformation of her world from the fully inhabited life of a woman at the center of things to the quieter, smaller world of a woman in her 80s whose children had moved to cities and whose friends had died or relocated or simply grown too frail for the social world they had once shared. The piano had been there through all of it. Not as therapy, not as consolation, not as the meaningful activity that people organize for elderly relatives to give their days structure, simply as the thing she did, the way some people read or walk because it was what she was, at some level below the circumstances of her life. She played at the Millhaven Arms on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Not for money, Pete Kowalski, who ran the bar with the comfortable informality of someone who had inherited it and considered it more of a social institution than a business, had offered to pay her, and she had declined on the grounds that accepting money would make it a job and she had enough jobs, or had had enough of them across her life, and was not interested in having another one. She played because she liked the acoustics of the room. The low ceiling and the plaster walls returned the sound in a way that the living room of her house did not, and the piano at the Millhaven Arms was better than the one she had at home, which had not been tuned in 3 years. These were practical reasons, honestly held, and she did not feel the need to supplement them with anything more elevated. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the bar had whatever patrons it had, sometimes a dozen, sometimes 4, sometimes on slow winter nights barely any. Eleanor played regardless. She did not adjust her playing for the audience or for its absence. She did not play louder when the room was fuller or softer when it was quiet. She simply played the standards she had learned across 75 years of sitting at keyboards, the songs that had accumulated in her repertoire the way objects accumulate in a house over a long lifetime, not collected deliberately but simply present, each one with its own history of acquisition, its own memory of when and where and why it had entered her life. On the particular Thursday night in 2012 when Michael Bublé's tour bus broke down outside of town, Eleanor was the only person in the Millhaven Arms. Pete Kowalski had gone home at 10, leaving the door unlocked in the way he left it unlocked on Eleanor's evenings. She had a key to lock up, had had one for 6 years, and had never once failed to use it correctly. She was alone, she was playing. And she had no idea that someone was standing outside the window listening. He stood on the pavement for perhaps 3 minutes before he went inside. Not because he was hesitant, he was not a man given to hesitation in situations that required action, but because there was something about the quality of the music coming through the glass that deserved to be received before it was interrupted. It was not a performance. It had none of the qualities that performances have, even very good performances, even the most intimate and honest performances he had given or witnessed. It had the quality of something being done entirely for itself, with no awareness of observation, no calibration for an audience, no shaping for effect. It was the sound of someone playing music because the music was what they were doing, because it was the evening and the evening was the time for this, because the piano was there and their hands were here and there was no reason not to. Michael had been playing for audiences his entire professional life. He understood from the inside how profoundly the awareness of being heard shaped the act of playing. How the presence of listeners, even one listener, even a single person in a room, changed the quality of attention you brought to the sound, changed the way you inhabited. A phrase changed the relationship between the feeling you were trying to communicate and the feeling you were actually having. The best performances dissolved that distinction, made the performed emotion and the felt emotion the same thing, but they were still, at some level, performances, still shaped by the knowledge that someone was receiving them. What he was hearing through the window of the Millhaven Arms had no shaping. It was unmediated in a way that made the word performance entirely inapplicable. Eleanor Marsh was not performing. She was playing, in the way that the word is used when no audience is implied, the way children play, before self-consciousness arrives and the awareness of being watched transforms what is happening into something performed. He had not heard anything like it since childhood, since the afternoons in his grandfather. Demetrio's house, when the music played from the turntable and no one was required to respond to it, when it simply existed in the air of the room and he stood and listened and felt what it made him feel without any awareness that the feeling was supposed to lead somewhere or produce something or serve any purpose beyond itself. He went inside. The door was unlocked. Eleanor did not notice him immediately. She was in the middle of something, somewhere inside the music, in the specific way that musicians sometimes disappear into what they are playing, becoming temporarily unavailable to the world outside the sound. He sat down at the bar quietly, in the way you sit when you understand that sitting quietly is what the situation requires. And he listened. He listened for 2 hours. Eleanor noticed him eventually. She had to. The bar was small, and when she reached the end of a piece and came back to the surface of the room, there was a man sitting at the bar who had not been there when she began playing. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "The bar's closed." He said, "I know. I'm sorry. I heard you playing and I couldn't walk past." She looked at him for a moment with the specific directness of a woman who has been alive for 81 years and has developed a precise and efficient instrument for assessing people. Then she said, "Well, stay if you want." And then she went back to playing. He stayed. She played. The 2 hours that followed were, by Michael's own account in the private conversations he later had about the evening, unlike anything he had experienced in his professional life. Not because the playing was technically superior to what he encountered in his own world, it was not, or not in the ways that technical assessments measure, but because of what it was not. It was not aimed at him. It was not shaped for his reception. He was in the room, and the music was in the room, and those were two separate facts that did not need to be integrated into a single relationship. He received the music without being its intended recipient, which turned out to be a completely different experience from the one he had in every other room where music played. He thought about his grandfather, about the afternoons in Burnaby when Demetrio played his records, and the music existed in the air of the house without requiring anything from the people in it. He thought about the first time he had understood what music was for, not what it was for professionally, not what it was for in terms of communication or performance or connection with an audience, but what it was for in the more fundamental sense that preceded all of those applications. Music was what Eleanor was doing right now, at 11:30 on a Thursday night in a bar in Millhaven, Ontario, with no one to hear it and no reason to play it except that it was what she was. When Eleanor reached the end of a piece and did not immediately begin another, when the silence of the room held for a moment the way silences hold after music that has been serious, Michael said the only thing that had been forming in him across the 2 hours of listening. He said, "Why do you still play?" Eleanor Marsh did not answer immediately. She sat at the piano with her hands resting on the keys, not playing, just resting there, the hands that had been doing this for 75 years occupying their natural position. She looked at the middle distance above the piano in the way that people look when they are considering whether a question deserves its honest answer or its social one, and if the honest one, how to deliver it in a form that the person asking can receive. She said, "Because the music doesn't care whether anyone hears it." Michael was quiet. Eleanor continued, "I've played for people all my life. I played at weddings, and I played at funerals, and I played at school concerts and church services, and I played for Pete's customers every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years. And I used to think the playing for people was the real thing, that the playing alone was just practice for the playing for people." She paused. She looked at him directly for the first time in 2 hours. She said, "I was wrong about that. The playing for people is lovely. I'm not saying it isn't. But it's a different thing from this." She touched a key, a single note, let it sustain and fade, is the thing itself. She said, "The music doesn't need anyone to hear it to be music." She said, "I think I've been playing all these years because I needed to understand that." Michael sat with this. Outside, the Canadian night was very quiet. The main street of Millhaven was empty of everything except the cold. He had come in from that emptiness because of what he heard through the window, and what he had heard through the window had no audience in it, and yet had been, in some way he had not previously encountered at this level of directness, the most music he had ever heard in a single room. He said, I've always thought it was for the people listening. Eleanor looked at him. She said, it is, but it's also for you, and if you're playing it for them and not for yourself at the same time, she shook her head. She said, that's not sustainable. That's a career. It's a good career, and I'm sure yours is a very good one. But it's not the same as what happens when there's nobody here and the music plays anyway. She touched the keys again, a chord this time, let it fill the room. She said, this is why music exists. The rest of it, the concerts and the recordings and the people, the rest of it is beautiful. But this is why, Romans 7. What Michael carried away, he left the Millhaven Arms at approximately 1 in the morning. Eleanor locked up behind him, as she always did, with the key Pete Kowalski had given her 6 years earlier. He thanked her. She said, you're welcome, though she said it with the slight inflection of someone who was not entirely sure what he was thanking her for, since from her perspective the evening had been exactly like other evenings she had played and someone had listened, which happened sometimes and was fine when it did. She did not ask his name. He did not offer it. He walked back to the motel through the cold and got into his room and lay on the bed without sleeping and thought about what Eleanor Marsh had said until the morning arrived with its logistics and his tour resumed, and Millhaven receded into the category of unplanned stops that touring life produces. But what she had said did not recede. It had arrived with the specific quality of things that are true and that a person was ready to receive, the readiness being the reason the truth lands rather than glancing off, the specific alignment of a question that has been forming for years and an answer that arrives before the question has been fully articulated. He had spent his career thinking about music as communication, as connection, as the act of reaching other people through sound. All of that was real and none of it was wrong. But Eleanor had added something to it, or rather, she had revealed something that had always been true, but that his professional framework had not quite made room for, that the music existed before the audience, that its existence did not depend on the audience's presence. That the playing in the empty room at 11:30 on a Thursday night was not a diminished version of the playing in the full arena. It was a different thing, related but not equivalent, and understanding the difference was the difference between a career and a life in music. He began, in the months that followed, to change something about how he rehearsed. He began to arrive at the rehearsal room before the band, before the production team, before anyone who constituted even a minimal version of an audience, and play alone. Not to practice, he practiced with the band. Not to prepare for the performance, he prepared for the performance in the ordinary, structured way that professional performance preparation requires. He played alone for the same reason Eleanor played alone on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in the Millhaven Arms. Because the music needed to exist without anyone, because he needed to exist with the music without anyone, because what Eleanor had said was true, and it required practice to make it felt rather than merely understood. Michael Bublé has spoken about that night in various contexts over the years, always obliquely, always without the specifics that would locate it in a particular place or attribute it to a particular person. He has said things like, I met someone once who reminded me that the music exists whether or not anyone is listening, and that understanding this is essential. He has said, the performances are one thing and the music is another, and keeping both alive requires knowing the difference between them. Eleanor Marsh continued to play at the Millhaven Arms on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for another 4 years, until her health made the drive into town impractical. Pete Kowalski drove her on the evenings she wanted to play for 2 more years after that, until the evenings became too few and then stopped. She died at 87 in the house where she had lived for 50 years, a few blocks from the piano that had outlasted most of the things in her life. Pete Kowalski had the piano tuned after she died, properly tuned for the first time in years, and left it in the corner of the bar where it had always been. He put a small, framed photograph of Eleanor beside it. Nobody touches the piano now. Pete says it is for whoever needs it next. He says Eleanor would have understood that. Michael Bublé still plays alone. 4 concerts in the rehearsal rooms in the specific quiet of the time before the audience arrives and the performance begins. He plays music that is not for anyone, that is for the reason Eleanor described, the reason that preceded all the other reasons, the reason that made all the other reasons possible. He has never been asked about this practice in a direct enough way to explain it fully. But if he were, the explanation would begin on a cold night in a small Canadian town, through the window of a bar that was closed, where an 81-year-old woman was playing piano for no one and for the only reason that had ever been sufficient. The question Michael had been unable to answer: if no one were listening, would you still play? Received its answer not from reflection or deliberation, but from a Thursday evening in Millhaven, Ontario, and from an 81-year-old woman who had been answering it, quietly and without knowing it was a question, for 75 years. The answer was not yes or no. It was more complicated and more true than either of those options. The music plays because it needs to, not because someone is listening. The listening is a gift that the music can receive, but the music does not require the gift in order to be music. Michael walked out of the Millhaven Arms that night understanding something about his own relationship to the art he had built his life around that none of the performances had quite produced, not the sold-out arenas, not the Grammy Awards, not the millions of albums sold, not the sustained career across 2 decades of sustained commitment. He understood it because Eleanor Marsh had been playing for 75 years in rooms that sometimes had people in them and sometimes did not, and had arrived at a clarity about why she was still playing that the presence of audiences had not given her and their absence had not taken away. It was simply the music. It was always simply the music. Before the career and inside it and after it, in the quiet of the Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and in the quiet of the rehearsal room before the band arrived, and in the quiet of whatever comes next, the music, playing for the reason it has always played, which is the only reason that was ever actually necessary.